You're ruining everything. She doesn't even know who you are." Blair's voice cracked through the stillness, sharp and venomous. Deborah didn't flinch. "I know exactly who you are," she said, quiet but firm. A teacup shattered between them, porcelain skidding across polished marble. Elizabeth recoiled, confused, clutching Deborah's arm like a child. From the doorway, Donald spoke, low, stunned, almost to himself. What is this?" Nobody moved. Deborah stood her ground. Blair stared, breath caught in rage, and then, barely above a whisper, Elizabeth said the word that froze them all. "Daughter?" The room held its breath, and in that moment, everything they'd been pretending collapsed. He was a billionaire who had built everything from the ground up, except the people closest to him. Donald Bren didn't just live in luxury, he ruled it. Private jets, strategic acquisitions, hand-tailored suits stitched in silence. His name echoed across Manhattan boardrooms and Malibu wine cellars, the kind of man who gave to charities without shaking the hands of those they helped. And inside his Connecticut estate, the one with columns tall as courthouse pillars and gardens manicured like museums, everything appeared perfect. But perfection is the first thing to rot when no one's watching. His mother, Elizabeth Bren, once commanded ivy-covered classrooms with wit and certainty. Now she wandered through linen hallways asking for students who no longer existed. She spoke to portraits as if they might speak back. The only person who answered her was not family, not a nurse, not even someone considered important enough to sit at the table. Her name was Deborah Hudson, a 26-year-old maid hired to polish wood and carry linens, invisible by design, unacknowledged by habit. But day by day, when no one else noticed, she stepped forward. Not because anyone asked her to, because someone needed to. She made tea slowly. She spoke softer. She waited. She stayed. And she stood between Elizabeth and everything that came to harm her. Even when that harm wore red lipstick and diamond heels. Blair Kingsley, Donald's fiancée. A woman with ambition, a veneer of grace, and a talent for cruelty, especially when no one powerful was watching. And Donald? He stayed busy. Too busy. Secure in the belief that money solved what time could not, that a private nurse, a polished girlfriend, and a pristine home meant everything was under control. He was wrong. Because one day, not long from now, he'd walk into a room and see something he couldn't unsee. And everything after that would never be the same. But before we begin, click subscribe, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's go back to where this really started. He was the kind of man who moved through life like it owed him silence. Every morning, the gates of the Bren estate hissed open to a silver Maserati, its engine a low growl against the marble stillness. Staff moved like ghosts. Groundskeepers raked gravel into perfection. Inside, the halls gleamed, cream walls, cold art, everything staged for a magazine cover no one asked for. Donald Bren didn't notice the details, he didn't have to. The house ran like his company's, silently, without friction, without flaw. His mother lived in the East Wing. That's all he needed to know. She was taken care of, fed, dressed, tucked in. What he didn't know was that most nights she fell asleep crying, or that the only person holding her hand when she called out for someone long dead was a maid named Deborah. She wasn't supposed to be doing any of that. Hired through a third-party agency, Deborah's contract had no mention of care, no health background, no medical pay, just vacuum, dust, fold, repeat. But from the moment she saw Elizabeth, frail, confused, left too long in a velvet armchair, she knew none of that mattered. Deborah didn't ask permission. She simply stayed. When Elizabeth asked where she was, Deborah answered. When she mistook her for an old student or called her by a stranger's name, Deborah smiled and answered anyway. She was used to responsibility, grew up with 3 younger siblings and a single mother who worked 2 jobs in Baltimore, learned how to cook with one hand and rock a crying baby with the other. She wasn't trained for this, but she was made for it. And in a house that prized stillness over warmth, she was the only living thing left. Then there was Blair. To the press, she was Donald's perfectly polished fiancée, a philanthropy consultant with flawless skin and an effortless laugh, the kind of woman who wore cruelty like perfume, noticeable but never called out. In front of Donald, she called Elizabeth dear, and air kissed her cheek. When he left, she rolled her eyes, huffed, sighed at the sound of Elizabeth's voice, like every repeated question cost her $1,000, and Donald, he never stayed long enough to see it. When Blair suggested moving his mother to a private care facility, he nodded. When she said Elizabeth needed structure, he agreed. He didn't realize that structure was code for silence, distance, erasure. Deborah did. She saw how Blair rearranged furniture without asking, hid Elizabeth's keepsakes, turned up the TV when she spoke. She saw the way Elizabeth's face changed when Blair entered a room, stiff, anxious, ashamed, but Deborah said nothing. She couldn't afford to. Still, something stirred. She began writing things down, dates, words, patterns, a quiet journal of what happened when no one else paid attention. She didn't know why she was doing it, not yet. One afternoon, after guiding Elizabeth through her favorite poem for the 5th time, I wandered lonely as a cloud, Elizabeth looked up and smiled. "You're the only one who listens to me," she said. Deborah didn't know what to say, so she just nodded and kept listening, because something was coming, something that would rip the mask off the mansion, the fiancé, and the billionaire himself. And when it did, Deborah would be standing right where she always had been, between what's easy to ignore and what's too human to turn away from. Every morning, long before the marble floors gleamed and the espresso machine hissed to life, Deborah was already awake. She moved through the house in silence, slippers barely brushing the tile, robe tight around her waist, hair tied back with a worn black band. The sun hadn't touched the garden yet. Even the air inside the mansion felt asleep. But Deborah was already in the kitchen, her hands working in rhythm. Boil the oats, slice the strawberries, measure the tea leaves just right, no caffeine, no bitterness. Elizabeth liked chamomile in the morning. It made her feel safe, though she never remembered asking for it. By the time the rest of the staff arrived, pressed uniforms, practiced smiles, Deborah had already carried breakfast upstairs on a tray lined with soft linen. She would knock gently, then enter. "Good morning, Miss Elizabeth." Sometimes Elizabeth would smile, sometimes she'd look up and blink, unsure who she was speaking to, and other times she'd already be talking to no one, to everyone, asking about her students, the syllabus, the final exams. Deborah would set the tray down, sit beside her, wait, no rush, no correction, just presence. She'd learned early on that arguing with memory only made the cracks deeper. So instead, she met Elizabeth where she was. If she was in 1967, Deborah found a way to join her. If she thought the hallway was a classroom, Deborah became her assistant. There was no playbook for this, just instinct, patience, and love. Deborah had spent her life carrying weight that wasn't hers. The eldest of 4 in a 2-bedroom apartment in West Baltimore, she learned to braid hair, iron uniforms, and pack school lunches before she even finished grade school herself. Her mother worked nights, cleaning offices downtown. Her father wasn't in the picture. Responsibility was never discussed. It just arrived. And so, when Elizabeth reached out with trembling hands and whispered names from another life, Deborah didn't flinch. She'd been training for this kind of care her whole life. But the mansion, for all its chandeliers and curated silence, wasn't a peaceful place. Not really. Because then there was Blair. In front of Donald, she was all grace and light touches. "How's your mother, darling?" she'd ask, draping an arm through his as they passed Elizabeth's room. She seemed bright today. She always smiled with her teeth, always just enough. But once Donald left, on business trips, weekend flights, long meetings in his office, the tone changed. Blair stopped asking, stopped looking, stopped pretending. And when Elizabeth repeated herself, asking again what day it was, or whether her father was still alive, Blair would sigh, loud enough for Deborah to hear. One afternoon, as Deborah helped Elizabeth to the couch, Blair passed behind them. She asks the same damn question every 5 minutes, she muttered, not bothering to lower her voice. Is that dementia or just a performance? Deborah didn't respond. She just settled Elizabeth into the cushions, tucked a throw around her knees, and quietly adjusted the lighting so it wouldn't cast shadows that might confuse her. She'd learned not to react, not out loud. But inside, something splintered. She began to track things, not in confrontation, but in quiet resistance. She noted how Elizabeth flinched when Blair entered a room, how her voice got smaller, how her fingers twisted into knots in her lap. Deborah started reading books on memory care, checked out from the local library, folded in her tote bag under the sink. She read late at night in her tiny room behind the laundry chute, learning how to ground someone mid-confusion, how to redirect agitation into safety, how to create small rituals that could tether a disoriented mind back to something soft, something known. Blair never noticed. She didn't ask. She assumed Deborah folded towels and disappeared. But Deborah stayed. She watched. She waited. Until one night, when the house was still, and Elizabeth stood by the window staring into the dark. "I think I missed my lecture," she said, eyes distant. "They're going to be so disappointed." "No, Miss Elizabeth," Deborah said gently, coming to her side. "You already gave it. They loved you." Elizabeth blinked, then smiled faintly. Deborah helped her back into bed, tucked her in, and sat with her until she fell asleep. As she turned to leave, Elizabeth's voice broke the silence. "Wait." Deborah paused. Elizabeth's eyes were open, foggy but focused. Her hand reached out, searching the air until it found Deborah's. "You're the only one who listens to me," she whispered. Deborah didn't speak. She just nodded once, soft, steady, and squeezed her hand. At first it was little things. The books on Elizabeth's bedside table began to disappear. Favorites she'd reread countless times, replaced by hardcovers with sleek covers and blank plots. The hand-stitched quilt from her sister vanished one afternoon and returned weeks later, folded at the bottom of a hallway closet. Her slippers, worn soft with memory, replaced with a designer pair still tagged and too tight. Elizabeth didn't always notice right away, but when she did, she'd tilt her head, frown, and murmur things like, "Wasn't there a photo here?" or "I thought this was my chair." And Blair always smiled. "You must have misplaced it," she'd say lightly. "You've been a little scattered lately, haven't you?" Then she'd glance at Deborah, a glance that said, "Don't." And Deborah didn't. Not yet. But each change chipped away at something unseen. Elizabeth, once eager to sit in the parlor or walk the garden path, now hesitated. Her eyes scanned rooms before she entered. She spoke less. She touched fewer things. Her shoulders curled inward slowly, like she was making herself small enough not to be noticed. Blair kept the act alive for Donald. Every weekend, she welcomed him with a curated smile and a report. "Your mother's doing all right," she'd say, "but she really needs structure, professional care. This house isn't enough anymore." Donald, always dressed in tailored grey and preoccupied with numbers, nodded. "I'll increase the staffing budget," he said. "Find someone certified, someone discreet." He believed discretion solved everything, that keeping Elizabeth's condition quiet was noble, responsible, loving even. What he didn't realize was that silence was doing more harm than any diagnosis. And behind his back, Blair grew bolder. She rolled her eyes at every repeated question, sighed loudly when Elizabeth asked if it was morning or night. One evening, after Elizabeth offered her a flower from the garden, one she'd picked with childlike pride, Blair didn't even look. "I'm allergic," she snapped. "Please don't touch my things." Elizabeth turned to Deborah later and whispered, "I don't think she likes me." Deborah wanted to say the truth. She wanted to say, "No, she doesn't, and she never has." But instead, she smiled. "She's just having a bad day." Inside, her stomach twisted. The weight of it was growing. Each moment she let pass, each word she swallowed, she was used to enduring. Growing up meant sacrificing your voice to survive. But this felt different. This wasn't just about her. This was about someone who couldn't fight back. Still, she hesitated. She wasn't blind to her position. One wrong word, and she'd be out, replaced, forgotten. There were cameras in the hallway, but none in the rooms that mattered. Everything she'd seen, every cruel whisper, every callous glance, existed only in memory. So she began to write. A small notebook, spiral-bound, kept in the drawer beneath her socks. Each page a record, a whisper trapped on paper, the date, the time, the words used, the way Elizabeth's hands trembled after being scolded, how she grew quiet when Blair entered the room, how she lit up when Deborah brought her tea, how she smiled when Deborah remembered her favorite slippers. It wasn't evidence, not yet, but it was something, a witness. And Deborah kept writing, because the more Blair pushed, the more Elizabeth pulled away from herself. She began apologizing constantly, for forgetting things, for asking questions, for existing. She started second-guessing her memories, unsure if the hallway had always looked like this, or if that painting really belonged there. Deborah reassured her gently, softly. Yes, that was your chair. No, you're not wrong. It's all right to forget. I'm here to help you remember. The only time Elizabeth relaxed now was when Deborah was near. Her shoulders dropped. Her words came easier. Some days she'd even laugh, a full, rich sound that startled the quiet out of the room. It never happened when Blair was there. One night, after Elizabeth had been tucked in and the halls grew still, Deborah sat by the window in her room, notebook in her lap. She stared at the latest entry. Blair had snapped again, something cruel under her breath about babysitting a corpse. Elizabeth had flinched. Deborah had said nothing. She looked out across the garden, its neat hedges casting long shadows in the moonlight. What would it take? How far would Blair go before someone believed her? The house was filled with silence, but Deborah could feel something moving beneath it, slow and heavy like a storm dragging its weight across the sea. She closed the notebook, set it aside, and whispered aloud just once, "She's not alone." Because even if no one else saw it yet, the cracks were forming. And something was coming. It started with a teacup, not a scream, not a fight, just the faint sound of porcelain slipping from trembling fingers. Elizabeth's hands shook as the cup shattered against the marble floor, tea spilling like a shadow at her feet. The noise echoed through the sitting room, sharp, final. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Blair turned. Her heels clicked once against the floor as she stepped forward. The smile she wore for everyone else was gone. "For God's sake," she snapped. "Can't you do anything right?" Elizabeth froze, her mouth parting in confusion. I'm sorry, dear, my hand just—" Blair cut her off with a short, cruel laugh. "Your hand. You're useless sometimes, do you know that?" She reached out and gripped Elizabeth's wrist, not enough to bruise but hard enough to make her flinch. Deborah saw it happen from the doorway. She didn't think. She just moved. "Please," she said softly, stepping between them. "I'll take care of it." Blair's eyes flicked to her, cold and deliberate. "I wasn't talking to you." Deborah bent to gather the broken pieces, careful not to look up. "It was just an accident." Blair's tone sharpened. "Know your place." The words hung in the air like smoke. Elizabeth blinked, frightened and lost, whispering, "It's just tea, dear, don't be angry." Blair turned away, muttering something Deborah couldn't quite hear, something that sounded like, "I can't keep doing this." And then she was gone, heels clicking back down the hallway, leaving silence in her wake. Deborah exhaled slowly. She took Elizabeth's hand, steadying her. "You're okay," she whispered. "It's over." But it wasn't over, not even close. The other staff had seen it, or at least enough of it. The butler had frozen in the doorway, pretending to rearrange flowers. One of the housekeepers had stopped polishing the banister, eyes fixed on the floor. No one spoke. That was how things worked in houses like this. You saw what you weren't supposed to see. You kept it quiet. Deborah cleaned the broken glass alone that afternoon. Every scrape of porcelain against the dustpan sounded like a warning she couldn't shake. By the end of the week, the mansion's tension had thickened, a kind of quiet dread that hummed beneath every polite conversation. Blair's voice was sweeter than ever when Donald was home, and sharper than glass when he wasn't. She began spending more time in his office, leaning over his desk, flipping through his schedule. "We should host something," Deborah overheard her saying one morning. "Something big, a dinner for your investors. It's been too long since people have seen the house, and you should remind them what the Bren name stands for." Donald didn't need much convincing. He loved appearances, the illusion of control. A perfect dinner, perfect guests, perfect home. That was something he could manage. "Make it happen," he said, not looking up from his phone. Blair smiled. "Leave everything to me." Within days, the mansion turned into a stage set. Florists came and went. Caterers measured table lengths. The staff worked double shifts polishing crystal and arranging silverware. Deborah stayed quiet through it all, guiding Elizabeth away from the noise. The older woman was agitated by the commotion. Too many new faces, too many footsteps in the hall. "Are we having guests?" she asked one afternoon, her voice uncertain. "Yes, ma'am," Deborah said. "Just a dinner. Nothing for you to worry about." Elizabeth smiled faintly. "I used to love dinners, everyone dressed so nicely. I should find something to wear." Deborah hesitated. "Maybe another time. You'll rest this one out." But Elizabeth didn't understand. To her, guests meant excitement, laughter, the sound of clinking glasses and music in the background. That evening, as Deborah helped her change into her nightgown, Elizabeth looked toward the closet. "Would you hand me the blue one?" she asked, pointing to a silk dress wrapped in protective plastic. "I think it still fits." Deborah tried to smile. "Maybe tomorrow." But Blair had other plans. When the schedule was finalized, she called Deborah into the study. "During the dinner," Blair said smoothly, "keep Mrs. Bren upstairs. We don't need any interruptions." Deborah frowned. She liked seeing people. It might help her feel— "I wasn't asking," Blair interrupted. Her voice was soft, but her eyes were sharp. "Keep her out of sight." "Understood." Deborah nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." Blair smiled. That perfect, polished smile. "Good girl." The night of the dinner arrived dressed in gold and expectation. Cars pulled up to the mansion gates, engines purring like low applause. The house sparkled. Candles, violins, champagne. Donald stood by the fireplace, shaking hands and telling stories that sounded practiced but charming. Blair floated beside him, every inch the hostess. Upstairs, the music drifted faintly through the walls. Elizabeth sat in her armchair, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She wore a strand of pearls Deborah had found tucked in a drawer, her hair brushed smooth, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Is it starting?" she asked. Deborah hesitated. "Yes, ma'am. But remember, you're resting tonight." Elizabeth smiled gently. "I used to host dinners too, you know. Always made sure the flowers matched the napkins. Your guests notice those things." Deborah's chest tightened. "They would have loved yours." Elizabeth looked down at her dress. "Maybe I'll just come down for a minute, to say hello." Before Deborah could answer, she was already standing, adjusting her pearls. "Mrs. Bren, maybe it's best—" Elizabeth smiled faintly, her eyes shining with a distant certainty. "It's my house, isn't it?" Deborah didn't stop her right away. She couldn't. Something about the quiet dignity in Elizabeth's voice made it impossible. But as the older woman opened her bedroom door and the sound of laughter spilled up the stairs, Deborah's heart began to pound. Because she knew, when the past walks uninvited into the present, something always breaks. And tonight, it would. The sound that started it all wasn't loud, just a single gasp, the kind that comes when fear and confusion blur together. Downstairs, the dinner was in full bloom. Crystal glasses clinked. Laughter rippled over the hum of violins. But in the space just beyond the dining hall, near the grand staircase, another sound cut through the perfection. Porcelain against wood. A startled cry. Elizabeth Bren stood trembling near the table of hors d'oeuvres, her silk dress slightly wrinkled, pearls askew. She'd wandered down the stairs, drawn by the music and voices. But the crowd wasn't what she expected. The faces were unfamiliar, the lights too bright. Blair turned from a group of investors, her smile freezing when she saw her. "Elizabeth," she hissed through clenched teeth. "What are you doing here?" Elizabeth blinked, nervous but smiling. "I just wanted to say hello. Everyone looks so lovely tonight." A few guests turned, whispering. Blair's jaw tightened. She grabbed Elizabeth's arm, too roughly. "You shouldn't be down here. You're not dressed for—" Elizabeth flinched. "You're hurting me." Blair's voice rose. "Then stop embarrassing yourself." The laughter from the dining room faltered. The violinist stopped mid-note. The air changed. And from the staircase landing, Deborah appeared. She had followed the sound of Elizabeth's voice, heart pounding. When she saw Blair's hand gripping the older woman's wrist, something inside her broke loose, stepping forward. Her tone was calm but firm, every word anchored in something larger than fear. "That's enough." Blair's head snapped toward her. "You stay out of this." Deborah didn't move. She reached for Elizabeth, gently guiding her back a step. "She's scared. Let her go." Blair's eyes flashed. "She doesn't even know what's happening." "Then you be the one to remember," Deborah said quietly. The tension in the room was a living thing, tight, coiled, waiting to snap. Guests looked away, pretending to sip from empty glasses. The staff froze along the walls. Blair let out a shaky laugh, trying to recover her poise. "You're just the maid," she spat. "Don't forget that." Deborah's hand trembled, but her voice didn't. "And she's your elder. Show some respect." For the first time, Blair's mask slipped completely. The charm, the polish, gone. What remained was raw fury. "Respect," she shouted. "You think I owe respect to this—" She stopped when a shadow appeared in the doorway. Donald Bren. He'd left the table minutes earlier, stepping out to take a call. Now he stood at the threshold, silent, taking in everything. The guests' wide eyes, Blair's twisted expression, Deborah's outstretched arm, and his mother's tear-streaked face. The truth unfolded in seconds, but it landed like a lifetime. "Donald," Blair stammered, straightening her dress. "She came downstairs. I was just trying to—" He didn't move, didn't blink. His gaze shifted slowly from Blair's hand, still half raised, to Deborah standing between them, to Elizabeth trembling behind her. "What's going on here?" he asked, voice low, steady, the kind that carried more weight than shouting ever could. No one answered. Elizabeth's breathing came in shallow bursts. She looked at him, confused, frightened. "Donnie." Something broke in him then, the sound of her voice saying his name that way, fragile, small, like she had years ago when she used to wake him for school. Blair tried again. "She's not well, Donald. She shouldn't—" "Stop." The word came from Deborah, not him. Her voice cut through the tension, quiet but unshakable. She stepped closer, still shielding Elizabeth. "She's my mother." The words hung there, soft but enormous, carrying a truth deeper than biology, a truth everyone in the room could feel, even if they didn't understand it. Blair turned toward Deborah, disbelief written all over her face. "What did you just say?" Deborah didn't repeat it. She didn't need to. Donald's eyes widened, not from confusion, but recognition. For the first time he saw what had been in front of him all along, the way Deborah steadied his mother's trembling hands, the patience, the gentleness, the quiet strength that had been caring for Elizabeth when he couldn't bear to look. It hit him like light flooding a room that had been dark too long. Blair saw it too, and she panicked. "Donald," she said, forcing a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "You're not seriously buying into this act. She's manipulating you." He didn't answer. "Say something," Blair demanded. Still nothing. He just looked at her, and that silence said more than any accusation ever could. Blair's face twisted, the calm cracking completely. "You know what? I don't need this." She jerked her arm free of his gaze and stormed toward the doorway, heels striking the floor like gunshots. The guests parted, whispering. Donald didn't follow. When the last echo of her footsteps disappeared, the room remained suspended in silence, only the soft sound of Elizabeth's breathing and the faint hum of a chandelier still swaying from the commotion. Deborah kept her arm around Elizabeth, steadying her. Donald took one slow step forward, eyes never leaving them. For the first time in years, he didn't see staff. He didn't see hierarchy. He saw a mother, and the woman who had been protecting her all along. And in that stillness, something wordless passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. The house that had been built on appearances had just cracked wide open, and nothing, not even silence, could hide the truth now. That night, the mansion sat in silence. The guests were gone. The music had stopped. The candles burned low in their crystal holders, melting into pools of wax that dripped, unnoticed, onto imported linen. Upstairs, Elizabeth was asleep. Deborah had stayed by her side until her breathing slowed and her fingers uncurled. The dress still hung in the corner, the pearls placed carefully in a velvet box. Nothing had been said after the incident. No one knew what Donald would do next, except Donald. He was in his office, alone. The door locked, the curtains drawn, and in front of him, on the security monitor, frame by frame, he watched the truth. He saw Blair's voice rise, saw her yank Elizabeth's arm, saw the way she snapped and twisted her face into a snarl the world never saw. He watched Deborah step forward, calm and steady, placing herself between them. Over and over again, he replayed the moment. Each time, the lie unraveled more. The woman he thought was a partner had treated his mother like a burden, a prop, something to hide when company came, and the woman he barely noticed had stood in the fire. Donald leaned back in his chair. His hands were clenched, but his face was unreadable. Then slowly he picked up the phone. "Send her to my office." When Blair entered the room, her heels tapped like knives against the marble. She walked in as if nothing had changed, dressed in silk, face set in manufactured calm. "Donald," she began, smiling softly, "I know that scene earlier was upsetting. I'm sorry you had to see her like that. You know how unpredictable she is." He didn't speak. She crossed the room toward him, smoothing her dress. "I've been thinking. Maybe we both need a break from all this. Somewhere quiet. Maybe the vineyard in Napa." "I watched the footage," Donald said. Blair stopped mid-step. He turned the screen toward her. The freeze frame showed her mid-shout, face twisted, Deborah standing between her and Elizabeth. "I saw everything," he said. She laughed, a brittle sound. "Donald, come on. You're really going to believe that maid over me?" His eyes didn't move. "Her name is Deborah." Blair's voice dropped. "She's manipulating you. That's what people like her do. She wants something. Your pity, your money, your name. Don't be naive." Donald stood, slowly, deliberately. "You hurt my mother," he said. Blair's face shifted, the mask slipping again. "You're choosing her over me." The question wasn't really a question. It was an accusation, a threat. Donald's answer was quiet, firm. "I'm choosing what's right." Silence. Blair's mouth opened, then closed again. For once, she had no words that could charm her way out of it. "I want you out of this house by morning," he said. That was it. No fight. No drama. Just the end. Blair stared at him for a long second, then turned on her heel and left, the door swinging shut behind her like the closing of a chapter no one would miss. Later that night, Donald knocked softly on a different door. Deborah opened it, unsure of what to expect. He didn't wear his usual confidence. No tailored suit, no commanding tone. Just a man with too much to make right. "I wanted to say thank you," he said. She looked at him, unsure. "For everything you did, for standing up for her, for protecting her when I didn't." Deborah glanced down. "I wasn't trying to cause trouble." "I know," he said. "That's what makes it worse. You did it anyway." She didn't respond. It was right. He took a breath. "I didn't see it. I didn't want to. I thought hiring the best staff, writing the biggest checks. That meant I was doing my part. But I wasn't there. Not really." Deborah's voice was low. "She needed someone to see her." "I see her now," Donald said, "and I see you." She looked at him then, not angry, but guarded. Her whole life, apologies came too late. And this one, she wasn't sure yet if it was different. I don't expect you to trust me, Donald added, but I'll earn it, starting now. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, the notebook she'd kept hidden. Found, but not opened. I didn't read it, he said. That's yours. Deborah took it slowly. He nodded once and turned to leave, but before the door closed he paused. You're not just the maid, he said. You're the reason my mother's still standing. And for the first time, Deborah didn't look away, because this time maybe he meant it. The mansion didn't change overnight. The marble still gleamed, the gates still whispered open at dawn, the staff still moved with careful precision, but something inside had shifted, not loudly, not all at once, but quietly, like sunlight creeping into a room long kept dark. Donald began to slow down. He cancelled 2 meetings the week after Blair left, skipped a gala he'd once considered mandatory. One morning, he stood outside Elizabeth's room for nearly 5 minutes before knocking, unsure how to begin again after so long. Inside, she sat by the window, combing her fingers through the air, as if conducting an invisible orchestra. "Hi, Mum," he said gently. She looked at him, eyes cloudy but warm. "You came," she whispered, as if he'd returned from war. Donald didn't know what to say. He just sat beside her and reached for her hand. He didn't understand how to care for someone slipping through time, but he knew someone who did. He found Deborah in the garden, kneeling by the hydrangeas, sleeves rolled up and dirt on her hands. "I need your help," he said. She stood slowly. "With what?" "With her," he answered. "I don't know what I'm doing." That was the first honest thing he'd said in years. Deborah didn't smile, but she nodded. Mornings changed first. Donald started taking his coffee in the East Wing. He watched as Deborah prepared Elizabeth's breakfast, not just what she ate, but how she sat, how the light was angled to avoid casting shadows that confused her. He noticed the routines Deborah had built, how she used scent, sound, rhythm to anchor Elizabeth in the present, the way she read the mood before speaking, the way she knew when to guide, and when to let Elizabeth wander gently through her memories. Some days, Elizabeth called him by the wrong name. Sometimes she forgot he'd ever left. But other days, her eyes were sharp. She remembered things, laughed at old jokes, called him Donny like she used to before the world got heavy, and those days began to come more often. It wasn't magic. It wasn't healing. It was presence, safety, trust. Deborah had built all 3. So one afternoon, Donald brought her into his office. "I want you to have full authority over her care," he said. "No more approval chains, no more waiting for my assistant to clear things." Deborah stared at him, cautious. "What does that mean?" "It means you make the decisions. You know her better than any specialist I could hire." She nodded once, unsure if it was real. "There's also a room," he added, "next to hers, private, sunlight in the mornings. It's yours." He didn't mention the raise, just had a counting process it quietly. He wasn't doing it for show, not this time. Weeks passed, the staff came back in small doses. Quiet, real. Music played from the old record player in Elizabeth's room. Deborah found a collection of 60s jazz records and played them during breakfast. Elizabeth tapped her spoon to the rhythm like she was back in Harlem dancing. Donald began reading to her in the evenings, novels she used to teach. He stumbled through the first few pages, but Elizabeth corrected him when he skipped lines. It became their ritual. Then one afternoon, something happened. The garden was warm that day. Elizabeth sat beneath the awning, wrapped in a light shawl. Deborah was beside her, trimming dead leaves from a potted rose. Donald stood nearby, quietly listening. Elizabeth looked between them, her eyes clearer than they'd been in days. She reached out, one hand resting gently on Deborah's. "Your family," she said. Not a question, not a slip. A truth. Deborah froze, then smiled. Donald didn't say anything. He just looked at them, his mother and the woman who had kept her safe, and for the first time in years, he smiled too. Not for a photo, not for the papers, just for them. The change wasn't loud. It didn't come with grand speeches or sweeping declarations. It started in the quiet corners. Rooms that once echoed with formality began to soften. The cold stillness that had clung to the mansion like frost started to thaw. It began with one light left on in the reading room, then a blanket draped, not folded, over a sofa, music playing, not to impress, but to soothe. For the first time in years, the mansion felt like it was being lived in, not performed in. The staff noticed it first, the difference in tone. They no longer tiptoed through hallways or whispered behind closed doors. Deborah's presence, once invisible, was now the center of quiet authority. The way she moved through the home made others feel safe to exhale. The butler, Mr. Leary, began cracking jokes again. The housekeeper brought in flowers from the back garden without being asked. Someone started playing the old upright piano in the evenings, softly, hesitantly, until Elizabeth hummed along. Laughter returned, not the staged kind that filled rooms during fundraisers, but real, human warmth. Laughter that came from presence. Donald stopped leaving. One event was postponed, then another. Eventually he cancelled a major gala in New York, the kind of fundraiser his name used to headline. When the press asked for a statement, his team gave them silence. He stayed home. Instead of rehearsing speeches or posing for photo ops, he spent his evenings in the sunroom with Deborah, helping build something small, a reading corner for his mother. A place with soft light, low shelves, a chair she loved. They filled it with the books Elizabeth once taught, bookmarked with notes from years ago. Deborah laid down a rug that wouldn't trip her. Donald framed a photo of her NYU classroom and hung it by the window. When it was done, Elizabeth walked in, looked around slowly, then sat, her fingers gliding across the spine of a familiar book. "She remembers this room," Deborah whispered. Donald nodded. "She built it. We just brought it back." The public began to notice his absence. Whispers swirled in business circles. Where was Donald Bren? Why was he missing from his own charity circuit? Why no press, no speeches, no deals? He heard all of it. He didn't care. Every morning he learned something new, not from a boardroom but from Deborah. How to speak slowly when Elizabeth was anxious. How to ground her with touch, not firm, just present. How to redirect a spiral of confusion toward something gentle and safe. "Don't tell her she's wrong," Deborah told him one morning as they helped Elizabeth back to bed. "Just help her feel like she's still right about something." He began to understand that memory wasn't about facts. It was about feeling safe when the facts slipped away. He started listening, not just to his mother, but to everyone he used to pass by. He listened to the gardener explain the best light for the tulips Elizabeth once planted. He asked the cook what meals calmed her most. He asked Deborah about her childhood, Baltimore, her siblings, the weight she carried so early. And slowly the walls he'd spent years building around himself, walls made of control, wealth, distance, began to lower. Not collapse, just lower. Enough to let people in, enough to let himself out. One afternoon, Elizabeth sat at the new reading corner with a children's book in her lap. Donald knelt beside her, unsure what she needed. She looked at him with wide, unsure eyes. "I think I'm waiting for someone," she said quietly. "Who?" he asked. She blinked. "My son. He was supposed to visit." He swallowed. "I'm here, Mom. I'm right here." She looked at him for a long time, then smiled faintly and reached for his hand. "I knew he'd come." He didn't let go. The house, once filled with cold beauty, became something else entirely. It wasn't about perfection anymore. It was about presence, slower mornings, softer nights, unfinished conversations that no longer needed finishing. The mansion hadn't shrunk, but somehow it finally felt human-sized, a place where people weren't just employed or preserved or managed. They were seen, they were heard, they were home. Time moved differently now, not rushed, not crammed into meetings or masked by noise. It unfolded quietly, day by day, in soft garden shadows and slow cups of morning coffee. One afternoon, Deborah sat beside Elizabeth on a wooden bench at the edge of the garden. The late sun filtered through leaves above them, casting golden lace across the shawl wrapped around Elizabeth's shoulders. A small breeze lifted her hair as she hummed a melody no one else knew the words to. Donald arrived carrying 2 mugs, steam curling into the warm air. He handed one to Deborah, then sat on the other side of his mother. For a few minutes, no one spoke. There was nothing urgent to say. That had become the beauty of their new rhythm. Silence no longer meant avoidance. It simply meant peace. Elizabeth looked down at their hands, resting on either side of her own. She smiled, gently tracing her fingers over theirs. "My 2 children," she said, her voice soft, certain. Deborah blinked, caught between surprise and grief. Donald didn't look away. He just nodded once, slowly, as if the words made more sense than anything he'd heard in years. Neither of them corrected her, because in some strange, sacred way, she wasn't wrong. Later that week, Donald sat in his study with the lawyer he'd trusted for over 2 decades, the same man who'd drawn up trust funds, negotiated deals, hidden assets. This time the conversation was different. "I want to create something real," Donald said, "not for headlines, not for tax benefits." The lawyer listened. "She doesn't want credit," he continued. "So don't give her that. Give her space, tools, the ability to help more people like my mother." He passed over a folder, already signed, a caregiving foundation, focused on dignity, access, memory care for families who couldn't afford silence. And at the center of it, Deborah Hudson, not a beneficiary, not a name on a list, a partner. When he told her, she didn't understand it at first. She'd never asked for anything. So when he sat across from her in the reading room, no ceremony, no audience, and handed her the documents, she hesitated. "I don't know what to say," she murmured. "You don't have to say anything," Donald replied. "You've already said everything that mattered, so by showing up." She turned the page slowly, still stunned. He waited, then added softly, "You reminded me what legacy really means, not buildings, not headlines." He looked toward the hallway, where Elizabeth's laughter echoed faintly. "But people." Deborah wiped at her eye, quickly, almost instinctively, like it was still something she wasn't allowed to show. But she didn't turn away. That fall, the roses in the east garden bloomed late. Elizabeth had more good days than anyone expected. Some afternoons she told stories that were whole and vivid. Other days she simply sat, hand in hand with Deborah, smiling at the sky as if waiting for it to say something back. The staff no longer called her Mrs. Bren behind closed doors. They called her Miss Elizabeth, the way Deborah always had. They called Deborah by name now, too. Donald visited the office less. He never announced it. He just started staying home more, watered the plants in the conservatory, read aloud in the afternoons, asked questions, waited for answers. He wasn't the same man who once believed legacy was measured in square footage, because sometimes legacy looks like a woman who says nothing and does everything. Sometimes it looks like a garden bench, 2 mugs of coffee, and a name spoken in love, even if it isn't technically yours. Sometimes it looks like this: a billionaire who thought control was everything, watching the world tilt, one gentle hand at a time.